Quick demo of this tutorial. Here we will build a beautiful quiz application with React.js and ASP.NET Core Web API with latest Material UI 5. This project is built from scratch so that you could learn all about full stack web development with React.js and ASP.NET Core Web API. Apart from creating a beautiful Material UI interface, you could learn best practices in using Context API, form design, routing, authentication in small applications like this, etc. So please watch till the end of this tutorial and build your own quiz application. So first of all, let's start with creating React app inside this project folder here. For that, we have to open command prompt from this folder directory. So you can use this shortcut inside this folder path here. Just type cmd, then hit enter. So here we have opened the command prompt from the same directory as that of this folder here. Now to create the React app, you can execute this command npx create React app, then name the application in small letters. Now before creating React or .NET Core Web API, make sure that inside the folder path directory here, we don't have any special characters. It might cause problems while running the application. I had some similar experience in past, so make sure to avoid special characters inside the folder path directory here. Now let's execute this create React app command. It might take a while, so please be patient. Finally, we have completed with the app creation command. As a result of that, here we have a folder with the same name as that of the React application. Now we have to get into this new folder, quiz client. Now let's open the folder within VS Code. For that, you can execute this code space then period or dot simple. Hit enter. So here we have the brand new React application with default components. Now let's run this application. For that, open the terminal. You can use this menu item here, or you can use the shortcut Ctrl Shift then backtick. Then execute this command npm start. It will compile and open this application in our default web browser. So this is how the fresh React app looks like. For designing this application, I'll be using Material UI components. I have already created a Material UI tutorial on this channel. It was created with previous version of Material UI. Soon I will be uploading a new version of the same. The existing tutorial link is given in video description and inside the icon top right corner. Now let's look how to integrate Material UI into our React application. For that, click on this get started button here. First of all, we have to install these libraries here. So let's copy this command. Let's open a fresh terminal like this and paste it over here. So here we are installing the core package of Material UI. These are two packages introduced in the latest version, which is a styling engine in version 5. So here we have successfully installed the packages. This documentation is recommending this Roboto font. So let's grab corresponding reference and let's paste that inside the index.html here. Let's paste it just above this head end tag here. We also need material icons. So let's copy this reference also and let's paste it over here. Now this index.html file has the HTML wrapping for the entire application. Inside this HTML we have this div with the ID root. This div is replaced within this index.js here, which is the root JavaScript file for any React application. You see, the root div is replaced with the components passed here. By default, app component is shown inside the root div. And here we have the app component. And whatever we have here is responsible for the default view of the application here. So first of all, let me remove these default HTML from here and this logo reference also. Now let's quickly design a login form for this application. First of all, I will create a new folder here called components, so that I will create this component login. To create the component, I will be using this snippet RFC React functional component. In order to use this snippet, first of all, you have to install this extension, this one here. Okay, now click on this. So here we have the corresponding component with the same name as that of this JavaScript file here, login. Now let's show this component inside this app component here. Now while tapping the component, you will see the suggestions, and if you click on that, corresponding import statement will be added at the top like this. Sometimes it may not work as you expected. In that case, you have to manually add the import statement up here. Okay, now let's design a form for the login operation with name and email address. For that, first of all, we'll be having an HTML form here. To disable default HTML validation, we can have this attribute. Now we need an input text box. For that, inside Material UI, you could see this component text field under components. We need a text box that looks like this. So we could do this text field. I don't know why my auto suggestion is not working for Material UI components, so I will add the import statement here. From Material UI material, we have to import text field. First of all, we have email, so label will be email, the name of the component. Now in order to look like this text box here, we have to set this variant property as outlined. So here we have the text box. Inside that you could see the auto suggestion or the previous auto complete from previous posted data. If you want to ignore previous posted data like this, you could set this attribute auto complete as off. Like this, we need one more text box for name. Now we need a submit button. For that we have a component button. You could see the same inside this menu here, or you could also search inside this text box. For that you can use the shortcut Ctrl+K so that you can easily find the component that you are searching for. So let's search for button. Hit enter, you could easily see the corresponding component document like this. So here we have the button component. While typing the component here, you could see the auto suggestion. If you can't, like this, just use the shortcut, hold Ctrl, then press space. Then you could see the possible auto suggestion. If you select the item, corresponding import statement specified here will be added at the top. So first of all, type is equal to submit. The variant will be contained. Size will be large. All of these properties and attributes are mentioned inside this documentation here. Inside the button, we will show this start. So this is how the login form looks like. Now let's fix everything in proper place. For that, first of all, we will wrap this form with this Material UI component box. It is similar to a div. Now in order to customize any Material UI component, you can use this property SX. For that, you can go to the corresponding API documentation for button. Here we have the corresponding link. So here we have the available properties for the component, and here you could see the SX. It will accept these types of data, and here this SX page tells how you can customize the component by passing an object like this. Okay, so here we go. SX. First of all, we want to pass an object. For that, first of all, we have to wrap everything with a pair of curly brackets like this. Since we have to pass an object, we need another pair of curly brackets like this. Now here we are going to customize these input text boxes here. Now if you inspect these text boxes, you could see that for any Material UI component, there will be a root CSS class like this. You can use the corresponding class for customizing this specific component. And the root CSS class for this text field component is MUI form control -root. To see the same, let's search for the corresponding API, text field API. Inside this documentation, at the end, you could see the root CSS class as MUI text field root. So in order to customize text field, you can make use of this class here. Now how this customization is done? For that, let me copy this CSS root class here. You could see the same root class applied to this root outermost div for this component text field here. The text field from MUI displayed with an HTML div, and the outermost div is having the root class specified inside this documentation here. Now in order to customize this text field, we'll be using the same class like this. So first of all, I'm pasting the class here. Now this class is applied to a child component text field when considered to this box component here. This is a child component for this box component here. So in order to specify that, we could do this. Now this and symbol represent this box component itself. Now when you specify a class with a space in between them, it means we are going to apply this CSS when this class comes as a child, right? This is same in CSS also. So this is how we do it. Whatever styles that we specify here will be applied to the children of this box having this class. So first of all, I want to specify a margin of the range 1. As per the SX abbreviation, you can shorten this like M, like this. Now you can see the margin is applied to these text field. Now in order to split these text field into multiple lines, I will add this width attribute here, 90%. See, both of them are displayed on separate lines. So this is how we are going to customize Material UI components from now onwards. Now we need a separate line for this submit button also. So I will add this SX attribute. We want to apply these styles to this component itself. So we can directly pass the style here, width is equal to 90%. Now I want to show this component inside a Material UI component card. So let's search for card here. Here we have various samples showing how you can make use of this component. Now let's quickly add the element inside this application here. Now with what we have explained, now you can easily follow and understand the Material UI components that I'm going to use inside this application. If you have any doubt, you can go through this documentation here. Now let's quickly complete this design here. First of all, we need a card component. The content of the card will be displayed inside this component card content. So let's move this form into this card content. Now let's set the width to 400 pixel. Now before anything else, I want to center this card component here. For that, I'm going to create a new component called center.js, and here we have the snippet to create the component. Now in order to center anything, I'm going to make use of Material UI component grid. So here we have the component grid. It is similar to the Bootstrap 12 grid system. First of all, we have this component grid, which is the container. So we have to specify that with this attribute container. And inside that, we need same component grid marked as item. So this is the container for the grid, and this is similar to a column. And the width of this column is specified with this attribute sx. And I will set it as to 1 column space. Now in order to align anything inside this grid at center, we could do this direction is equal to column and then set align items and justify content as center. And finally we have to set the min height. So I will use this property sx min height. I will set it as 100 vh. Now we just need to wrap everything inside this login component with this center component here. Whatever we have wrapped with this center can be accessed with the props parameter here. And it will be inside this property props children. Let's check that here. Sorry, we have a typo inside the center component. I always make this mistake. Instead of this equals simple, we need a colon. Boom, that's it. Now finally we need an h3 header for this login form here. So I will add this typography component. We need an h3 header, so I will set this variant as h3, and we need some vertical margin. So I will do this margin on y-axis of the range 3. Inside that we will show this quiz app. Now here we have everything we need. We just need to align them properly. For that I will add this CSS style here, text align as sender. Now there is one thing that I am recently concerned about, which is dark themes. These light themes cause a lot of eye strains compared to dark themes. So I'm going to quickly switch into dark theme with Material UI. So you can search for the documentation here. We just need to customize the default theme. So open this root JavaScript file index.js. If you want to stick with the light theme, you can ignore the steps here. So first of all, we need a theme object. And here we will call the Material UI function create theme. Now we have to pass the object with our customization. We just need to change the mode to dark. So let me copy this object from here and let's paste that over here. Now we'll wrap this app component with this theme provider. Now here we just need to pass the theme that we have just created. Now finally, in order to work this, we need to add one more component, CSS baseline. Boom, that's it. This is more healthy for your eyes in long run. Now here we have done with the design. In a bit we are going to create .NET Core Web API to store these email and name here. Before that, I just want to validate the form here. Let me close all of the component except this login component. Now first of all, we want to manage the values of these text field inside the state of this component, right? For that, we normally does this. We will be creating state object like this, value, then set value, and then we'll be initializing it with use state function. Inside this we will be passing an object with the initial values. Instead of this, I will be creating a separate folder called hooks. Inside that I will be creating this hook component use for. We have done this same multiple times in previous tutorials. I will just paste that same here and let's explain it. So here we have a component. Inside this hook we have two state objects, values and errors. Inside this values state object will be saving the values from these text field here. And the corresponding text field errors will be saved inside this object. This errors object is initialized with the empty object, and this values object will be initialized with an object returned from this function. This function will be passed as a parameter to this hook. We can see that in a bit. And here we have the handle input change. We don't have to rewrite that in all of the components where we have a form. And finally, we will be returning everything that is required for the component with the form. So let me get rid of this. Now we could do this. Now we can call the use form hook here. Now this hook returns an object with these properties. Now we can destructure the same inside this component here. Now in order to initialize this state object values, we have to pass this function, getFreshModel So I'll create the function here, getFreshModel. This is just a function to return an object like this. So here we go, name and email address with the default values is passed. Now we just need to pass the same inside this hook here. Now we can assign values from this object to this text field here. Values.email. The name of the component and the property used inside this state object must be same. That's how this hook is created. You could see that inside this handle input change here. Okay, I hope you don't need an explanation for this handle input change event method here. Most of you know how to handle this input change for these text fields here. Now we can provide the onChange event function, which is already defined inside the hook handle input change. Okay, that's it. Now let me copy this and pasting for name. So here we have assigned value for this text field. If you want to verify whether it is working properly or not, I will add this submit event login. So here is the function login with the default parameter e. First of all, we have to prevent the default behavior of the form, which is reloading the form. So prevent default. Now let's print the state object values. Now here we have the dev console. Let's enter some random values and submit the form. Boom, that's it. So the values from these input text fields are saving into our state object values. Now finally, I want to implement validation inside these form controls. For that, I will be creating a separate function, validate. First of all, we'll be creating an object, empty object like this. Then we'll be saving the errors related to email with this property email. Now in order to validate email addresses, I'll be using this regular expression. Now we just need to call this test function. Into that we can pass the values from our state email. If email is in proper format, then it will return true, so we don't have any error message. Otherwise we will say email is not valid. Now like this, we have to have the name validation. So values.name is not equal to empty string. Then we don't have an error message, else we will show this field is required. Finally, we will set these validation error messages into this state object errors returned from this hook here. So set errors. Into that we can pass this temp object, and finally from this function we need to return a boolean value indicating whether this form as a whole is valid or not. For that, all of these error messages here should be empty string, right? For that, we can make use of this object method values. Inside that we can pass this temp object. So actually this function returns an array of values inside this object here. And on that return array, we want to call this array method every. And inside this, we want to check all of the values inside this object are empty string. So if all of them are empty string, this will return true, otherwise false. So that indicates whether this form as a whole is valid or not. So inside this submit event here, we can call the function validate. So this log statement works if the form as a whole is valid. And finally, if any of these text field is invalid, we want to show them inside these corresponding text field here. In order to do so, in Material UI, first of all, we have to set this property error as true, and the validation error message will be shown with this property helper text. Now we want to do this dynamically if this field is invalid. For conditionally applying those properties, first of all, we wrap everything with a pair of curly brackets like this, and then I will do the destructure syntax like this. Inside the state object errors, if the value of the property email is empty or not. If it is not empty, we want to return an object with corresponding properties like error set as true and then the helper text, which is errors.email. If there is a validation error inside this property email, this object will be returned from this statement and it will be destructured here, and thereby the properties inside this object can be a part of this outer component here. So this is how we dynamically apply properties in React components. Now let me copy this and pasting for name text field. Now let me save this and back to the application here. Let's check whether it is working or not. Let's try to submit the form here. Let's provide an invalid email, pass some random name. So validation is working for name. Now let's make this valid. Boom, it's working properly fine. Now it's time to create an ASP.NET Core Web API project to save these informations from these fields and to process other queries related to quiz application. For this project, I'm using Visual Studio 2022 and the latest .NET Core version 6. Now let's start with creating the .NET Core Web API project. I will select this template ASP.NET Core Web API, name of the application Quiz API. Select the location where you want to save this project. So I'm selecting this project folder where we have already created our React application. As I mentioned already, make sure to remove special characters from this folder path directory here. So select the folder. Now let's create the project. Here I'm selecting the latest .NET Core 6 version. I will uncheck this configuration for HTTPS since we are creating this application for development. Make sure to enable this Open API support. It is really helpful to test the API. Now let's create the project. So here we have the brand new ASP.NET Core Web API project. First of all, let's start with DB model and DB creation using Entity Framework. For that, first of all, we have to install corresponding NPM packages. So right click on this project here, then manage and NuGet packages. Inside this browse tab, search for Entity Framework. Let's download this Microsoft Entity Framework Core. Now from this version drop down here, select the same version as that of the framework here. So 6 or 2. So selected the same version here. Now let's install the package. Accept the license. Now along with the package, we need to install these two packages, SQL Server and Tools. Select the same version as that of the framework. Click on Install. Entity Framework Core Tools. So here we have done with the installation of these 3 Entity Framework Core packages. Now let's create model classes for the DB. So first of all, I'll be creating the folder models. So first of all, we have question model. First of all, we have this primary key, question ID. Now the column corresponding to this property will be the primary key for this table. So we have to mark this with this key attribute. Now we have to import the corresponding namespace. For that, you can use this shortcut, hold Control, then press period. Now select this namespace here, data annotations. Then we have the actual question in words. Then image name. The name of the image required for illustrating this question will be saved inside this API and will be shown along with the question. So the image name will be stored inside this column and the actual image will be stored inside the project directory here. Then we have the 4 options for this question. Finally, the answer for this question, which is the index of the option from these options here. Since image name is optional, I want to make this property as nullable. For that, we just need to add this question mark as a suffix to this data type string here. Now, if we leave these model string properties as it is, when it is converted to the actual DB, the SQL Server columns corresponding to these properties will be having the data type of n-vocab max, which is more than what we need. So in order to limit the data type, we will specify the required data type here. So first of all, we have this attribute colon, import the namespace here. Now with this type name, we can specify the data type as n-vocab 250. So this is of the type 50 and vocab 50. Sorry, I made a mistake. All of these options are of the type string. So let me correct that here. And all of them will take the type and vocab 50. Now like this, let's create one more model for the participant. First of all, we have participant ID, then email, name of the participant, score, time taken to complete the quiz. Let's mark this property as the primary key. Now let's specify the column type for the string properties. So let me copy this. Let's add the corresponding namespace. So that's all we need as model classes. Now let's create the DB context. Quiz DB context. Now we have to inherit this from the entity framework class DB context. Now let's use the corresponding namespace entity framework core. Now we have to specify the constructor for this class, and this constructor will have a parameter of the type DB context options of the type quiz DB context as options. And we want to pass the same parameter to the base constructor. Now we'll be creating the DB and the tables corresponding to these model classes using migration. In order to do so, inside this DB context class here, we have to have a reference to those particular model classes here. For that, I will be creating properties of the type DB set with those model classes. Now, in order to use this quiz DB context by the framework, we have to inject this DB context instance into the framework. For that, open this program.cs file. In previous version .NET 5, we have been doing this in a file called startup.cs, but in .NET 6, we'll do the dependency injection inside program.cs. Now, for the dependency injection, we'll be using this builder instance here, builder.services.addDBContext of the type quizDB context. As an argument to this method, we'll be passing a lambda expression with these options, and here we have to provide the provider for this DB, meaning we are going to specify which database we are going to use for this application. It will be SQL Server, so we can call this method here use SQL Server. Now let's use the corresponding namespace. Now into this function, we have to pass the connection string. So first of all, let's save the connection string inside this app settings.json file here. So here we go, connection string, and inside this, I will save the connection string with this name dev connection. And now for the sake of explanation, let me paste the template for DB connection string here. So first of all, we have to provide the SQL Server instance name. In my case, it is local SQL Express. So here I'm using a SQL Express instance that is installed on my local machine. And here we have to provide the DB name, so quizDB. So there will be a DB created with this name quizDB. For this connection, we'll be using Windows authentication, so set this trusted connection as true. And finally, in order to execute multiple queries at a time, we have set this property multiple active result sets as true. Now before going further, first of all, check whether this instance is already started or not. For that, first of all, open your run window. For that, you can use the shortcut Windows logo key, then R. It will open up this run command here, and then just type services.msc. It will open a window containing all of the services installed on your system. So let's search for the SQL Server instance here. So here we have the SQL Server instance name SQL Express. So you have to use the same name inside this portion here. And make sure that this SQL Server service is already running inside your machine. If not, you can see a start option here. Now let me close these services here. So here we have a proper connection string. Save this back to this dependency injection here. Now in order to retrieve the connection string saved inside this JSON file here, we just need to do this builder configuration.get connection string. Here we just need to provide the connection name that we have used here. So it is dev connection. So here we have done with the dependency injection. Now let's build this project. After successful build, we are going for migration, which is the process of creating the actual physical DB with these model classes provided here. For that, first of all, select the project, then go to tools, then manage NuGet packages, then package manager console. And make sure the same project that we have here, quiz API, is selected from this dropdown. Now first of all, we have to execute this command add migration. I will name this migration as initial create. Hit enter. During this process, the actual SQL Server script will be created according to the model that we have inside this project, which is saved inside this new folder migrations. Now in order to execute the SQL script for creating the DB, we have to execute this command update database. You could actually see the SQL script inside this package manager console window itself. Now once it is done, let's check whether it is created or not. For that, I will open my management studio here. Now let's connect to the same server instance that we have specified in the connection string. So here we successfully made a connection to the SQL Server instance. Now let's expand this databases node here. Boom, that's it. So here we have the new DB with the name QuizDB. The name of this DB is already mentioned inside this connection string here. Now let's check whether those tables are created as per our model class. So here we have those two tables, participants and questions. Now make sure that these tables are created as per the model classes that we have provided here. The name of these tables, questions and participant, is taken from this DB context property dbSet. Now I have prepared 10 questions for this quiz app. So let's execute the query here. For now I will paste the insertion query here. I have given this SQL script inside the GitHub repository. Let's execute this. So here we have installed those 10 questions. Let's check that inside this table here. So here we have the 10 questions that I have prepared. The actual question is here inside this column. If there is an image for this question, the corresponding image name will be saved inside this column here. Then 4 options, and inside this answer column here, the correct option index is saved inside this column. For option 1, the index will be 0, then 1, 2, 3 like that, like the array index. Now enough with the DB. Now let's add this image mouse.png inside this project directory here. For that, I'll be creating a new folder, images. Now here is the image. Let me move this to the new folder here. Now it's time to create API controllers for these model classes. For that, first of all, let's build this project. After successful build, right click on controllers, then add controller. From this left panel, select API, then API controller with actions using entity framework. Model class will be question. Context is question DB context. Question controller. So here we have successfully created the API controller. Because of scaffolding mechanism, required web methods are already added to this controller here. Now there is a common error while creating controllers with this scaffolding mechanism, which is related to installing code generation design package. So let's check that here. Right click on the project, then go to manage and you get packages. And let's search for the package here, code generation design. So here is the package. It is already installed in this project. If you have an error message related to code generation package, if the package is not installed here, install the package with the same version as that of the ASP.NET Core. If it is installed and you have the same problem, then uninstall the package and install it again. Okay, so in most of the case that will solve the problem. Now back to this controller here. Now let's create one more controller for this model participant. Participant controller. Now that's also done. Now let's focus on this controller here. For any created controller, inside the controller constructor, you could see a parameter of the type QuizDB context. Now from where the value for this context parameter is passed. That's where dependency injection comes. So whenever there is a constructor parameter of the type QuizDB context, the instance for that will be passed from this dependency injection here. So that's how dependency injection works. An instance of this controller is created whenever we make a request to these web methods here. Then the framework automatically create an instance of this controller. Since we have a constructor parameter of the type QuizDB context, the dependency injection will provide the DB context. And it is saved to this private parameter underscore context. And inside these web methods here, the underscore context is used to feed or query the database that we have created. At this moment, we want to feed the participant email and name to this web API here. For now, let me collapse these web methods here. And for saving the participant details, I will be using this post web method here. So this existing post web API method will insert new participants. But we want some customization here. We will insert the corresponding participant details to the corresponding table. But if the combination of name and email is already existing, we won't insert it. Instead of creating a new participant, we will be returning the existing participant details back to the client side. So first of all, I'll be creating a temporary object here. Now let's check whether we have a participant with given name and email address. Participant, and we can call this var method, and here we have the lambda expression x such that x.name is equal to participant name, and let's compare the email also. And finally we have to call this method post or default. If there is no such participant, we will do the insert operation like this here. Else, we will assign the temporary participant to this participant variable. And finally, from this method, we will return the object participant. Okay, now let's run this application. Now by default, the ASP.NET Core Web API will open an interface to interact with the API that we have created. All of the web methods are here. You can test them with these interface here. We'll be testing some of the web API methods here. Now from this login form here, we have to submit the email and name. So back to the VS Code here. Here we have the login form submit event. Now, in order to make an API request from this React application to the web API method here, we need to install the package Axios. So let's do that here. I'll open new terminal and let's do this npm install Axios. Now, in order to handle API requests, I'm going to create a separate folder API. Inside that, we will create this index.js. First of all, let's import the Axios package here. Now let's create and export this constant base URL. Inside that, I will save this base address here. So let me copy this. Okay, that's it. Now I will paste this function here. I have been using this pattern in almost all of my React tutorials before. We have a function create API endpoint and which is exported from this index.js. For this function, we have an endpoint. And here we have generated the complete URL, and from this function we have returned an object with functions required for all of the operations. To retrieve all of the records, we have this fetch function. To retrieve a specific record with a given ID, we have this function here. In both of these cases, we are making a get request with the corresponding URL. And with this function, we are inserting a new record, and here we have the put method to update an existing record, and this delete function delete an existing record. So these methods get, post, put, delete methods are from Axios, and they will make a get request these corresponding web API methods of the type put, post, get, etc. You will understand this better as we go forward. So inside this form submit event, we have to make a post request to this controller web API method here. For that, we could do this. First of all, we will call the method that we have just created. Into this function, we have to pass the endpoint for the URL. So the base URL is already created, base URL with the API, and we just need to append this controller name here, participant. So that's the default route in an API controller, which is already mentioned at the top here. API/name of the controller, in this case, participant is the controller name. So API/participant. Now we just need to pass participant here. In order to avoid typo here, I will be creating a constant object here, endpoints. It's an object, and here we will do this participant. I will save the same inside this property, and let's export this constant. Now we just need to do this endpoints participant. Now this will return a collection of objects like this. In order to make a post request, we can call this function post. Into this function, we just need to pass the object that we want to insert. The URL is already generated up above here. So we will pass the state object values, which contains the feed values here. Now we can handle the response inside this then function here. So here we have the callback with the response. For now, let's print this response in developer console. Response. If there is any error, we can handle that inside this callback here. Now let's save this and back to the application. Now let's submit this form for creating a new participant. Now let's submit the form. Here we have an error. So here is the problem. There is a security feature in almost all web API projects called cross-origin resource sharing. Meaning this web API will block requests from another application which is hosted on a different domain or a different port number, like this case. Here we have different port number. So this web API will block requests from the port number 3000 here. So first of all, we have to enable CORS for this port number here. Back to the web API here, and let's stop this execution. Now once again, open this program.cs file. Now let's enable CORS. We can make use of this method, use CORS from this app object here. And here we have the lambda expression with options dot with origins Inside that we have to pass the corresponding origin. So let me copy paste that from this React application here. Make sure to remove the / at the end. And finally, we have to call these two methods, allow any method and allow any header. Now let's run this application without debugging. Now back to the React application. Let's clear these existing errors here. Let's submit this form again. Boom. Here we have the response from the post web API method. And this property data is having the response that we have sent from this post web API method here. Now let's check the participant table. That's it. So here we have the new participant, John Smith. Now in order to check whether it creates a duplicate participant, let's reload this page and let's try to make the same participant again. In order to make it easy, I will enable this option for autocomplete. So let's set this as on here. Save to the application, reload. This time it's not working because previously the autocomplete was off. In future, the previously posted data will be shown as an auto suggestion here. Now I will just copy the details from this table here. Submit the form. We got the response with the same data. From this participant ID itself, we could say there is no new participant. The existing participant must be returned. See, that's it. So login is working perfectly fine. Now what else? Now from now onwards, the real game begins. Now we need a state management mechanism to store or preserve and share the data inside the application across various components inside the application. In previous React applications, we were using Redux, but for this application, we'll be using Context API. So let's integrate Context API into this React application here. First of all, let's create rest of the main components inside the application. After login, we'll be showing this component here, question. Now here we have the final component for showing the result of this quiz program. Now let's look how to preserve the state of this application and how to share common data among these components. For that, I will be creating a new hook here. Use state context. First of all, we need a React component. So here it is. And let's name this as context provider. Now let's create a context object, state context. Now we just need to call this function create context. So the nice thing about this context API that everything is already there inside the React library itself. Now let's add the corresponding import statement. So for this component here, we have the default parameter props. Now we will be wrapping everything within this context provider where we need the data from the context API. So whatever we have wrapped with this provider can be accessed with the children property here. Now from this component, we are wrapping everything with the context provider like this. State context dot provider, and we'll be showing the children here. Now for this component, we'll be creating a state object like this, context and set context. And let's call this function use state. So inside this context object, we'll be saving the data that we want to share across these components here. Now in order to initialize this context object, I will be creating a separate function, get fresh context. From here, we will return an object with properties that we want to save inside the context with their default values. So first of all, we have participant ID initialized with 0. Then time taken to complete the quiz, selected options array. So these are the data that we want to share globally across this application. If you find anything additional, you can add them here. Now let's call this function here. Now we will pass this as a value to this context API here. Context and the corresponding set context function. So the data of this context is saved inside this component state object context, and it is shared across the children of the context provider here. So here we have created and exported this context provider. Actually, we don't want to export it as default, so let me remove this from here. Now let's wrap everything within this context provider. Now let's open the index root JavaScript file, context provider. Now this app component and its children components can access the data from this context provider here. Let's check how it is done. So first of all, we have to export this context object here. Now let's try to access the values from this context inside this question component here. First of all, we have to call this function use context. Inside that, we can pass the state context object that we have created. So let's add the corresponding import statement. Now this function will return an object. Now we can destructure the same here. The return object will be similar to the object that we have passed here. It will contain this context and set context. So while destructuring, we can use the same property name. So let me copy this and paste in here. Now this context object contains the values from context API, and this set function can be used to update values inside the context here. So it is exactly similar to handling a React component state object. The only difference is that here we have a context provider, and this provider is used to wrap every component inside the application, and that's how this context is made available across the children components. In order to update the values inside the context API, we can do the same thing that we do with a component state object. We will destructure whatever we have inside the context. Now if you want to update the time taken for this quiz program, we can just update that property here. So this is how context API works. Now we want to make these steps even more simple, because here we have imported the use context function and the context API object, and everything is destructured here. In order to update the values, we need another destructuring here. So I would like to show you a best practice that you can reuse in your applications. For that, we'll be creating a hook here called use state context. And let's export the same by default. Now inside the hook, we will destructure everything inside the context API. So let me copy paste this. Now from this hook, we will be returning the destructured context and the corresponding set function. Now we don't need to import this state context object and this use context function here. We just need to call the hook that we have just created, use state context. Now I want to even simplify this set context function here, just to avoid this destructuring here. For that, I will redefine this set context function here. So here we have the function. For this function, we expect a parameter object, and this object contains the properties inside the context with the updated values. Okay. Now inside the function, we'll be calling the original set context function. Inside that, first of all, we will destructure the context object, and then we will destructure the object parameter. So the redefinition of the set context function is only there inside this return object. Inside the child component, we don't have to destructure the context object again. We just need to pass an object like this. It will be destructured inside this redefined function here. Hope you will find this more efficient. So this is how we are going to use context API inside the application. Let me remove these statements from here. Now let me remove this set context function invocation here. Now back to the login form. Let me try to log in with the same details that we have provided previously. So after successful login, we have to save this participant ID inside our context API. For that, let's call this use state context hook that we have created here. Context and set context. Let's call the hook use state context. Now inside this success callback, we just need to update the corresponding participant ID. So we'll call this function set context. Inside that, we just need to pass an object with the updated participant ID. So the return data from the server can be accessed with this property data. Inside that, we have this property participant ID. Now if you want to check the values inside the context API, let's print the same here. Context. Now let's try to log in with the previous participant. Submit the form. Sorry, here we have an error. Set context is not a function. So let's start with the context provider itself. We have created the state object context and its set function, and we have passed the same here. This pair of curly brackets indicate that we have something from JavaScript. Since we have to pass this context object and this set function, we have to pass them inside an object like this. Then only it will work as we expected. Okay, so an object with the context object and its set function is passed to the context provider here. Let me save this and back to the application. Let's try to log in with the previous participant. Let's check the console window. Here we have printed the values from the context API, and it is showing the initial value itself, not the updated participant ID, because this set context function is asynchronous. Immediately after invoking this function gets executed. Since this function is an asynchronous function, it is running in the background, and this function will get executed even before updating the value here. So if you want to see the context value, I will do something else. Inside this render method, we can print the context value, participant ID. Reload the app. Initially, you could see that its value is 0. Now let's try to log in with the same participant. Boom, that's it. The value of the participant ID inside the context is getting updated. Now after this login operation here, we want to show the quiz component where we are planning to show the questions from our DB. For that, first of all, inside this application, I'm going to rename this component as quiz component. Let's update the name here also. Now currently inside the default app component app.js, we are showing the login component. Instead of that, we need a simple routing configuration inside the application. For that, first of all, we have to install this npm package React Router DOM. So here we have successfully installed the package. If you are new to React Router, don't worry, this application is perfect for you to understand how React Router works. Now let's get rid of this login component. First of all, we need to wrap everything with this component, browser router. And we have one more container, routes. Now we can specify the routes for this application. So first of all, we have the default route for the login component. For the default component, path will be a /. With this element property, we can specify the component that we want to show inside this route, which is login. Now let me duplicate this for rest of the two components, quiz and result. So here we will be showing the quiz component, and here we have the result component. Sorry, we forgot to import routes and route. Hope you know the shortcut for possible imports. Hold Ctrl then press space. Now let's do the same for this route. Reload the application. So by default, the login component will be navigated with this default route here. Okay. Now after the successful login, we have to navigate inside this route /quiz. In order to navigate into the quiz route, first of all, we have to call the use navigate hook. So we could do this navigate is equal to use navigate. Now inside this successful callback, we just need to call the function navigate with the corresponding route /quiz. Before trying this, let me print this participant ID inside this quiz component here. So we have already destructured the context. Now let's print the context value inside the dev console. Context, that's it. Let's log in with the previous participant. Boom. So here we have successfully logged in inside the application, and here we have the quiz component. Now here we have the current value from the context API. Now there is one thing that you must know about context API. The values inside the context API will be lost once you reload the application like this here. See, the participant ID is reset to its initial value. So how can we preserve the context API value across the application? Now let's look why it is not working after the page reload and how we can fix the problem. First of all, we have saved the data inside this component React component state object context. So data saved in any React component state object will be lost after the corresponding page reload. And this context provider or context API only share the data that is provided here to its children components here. So both of these state object and context API does nothing to preserve data across page reloads. In order to fix this problem, there is a storage facility in web browsers called local storage. We can actually see the data saved in local storage through web browser dev tools. I will show you that in a bit. Before that, let's briefly discuss how we can make use of this local storage. First of all, in order to save a data, we can make use of this method setItem. As a first argument, we have to pass a key to uniquely identify the data that we have saved. And as a second parameter, we have to pass a JSON string corresponding to the data. In order to retrieve the data, we can make use of the method getItem. So it will return the data saved inside the key provided here. Finally, in order to remove a data stored in local storage, we can call this method removeItem. So that's all you need to know to work with local storage. So let's integrate local storage into this application. So first of all, anything that we want to save inside this context state object, we will save that first inside this local storage here. So we could do this local storage dot set item. I will use this key context. Now here we have to pass the data in JSON string format. For that, we can make use of this method JSON stringify. Now let's pass this default data here. We only need to initialize the local storage with this default object for the first time. So first of all, we will check whether we have an existing local storage for the context. Now with this method getItem, we can check what is inside this key context. We will only initialize the local storage if this context is not already occupied. So we can check that by comparing it with null. So basically this function is used to initialize the context object here. So we have to return the actual data here. So we will provide that from this local storage here. And don't forget this, the data stored inside the local storage is in JSON string format. So we have to convert that into an object with this method JSON parse. So this method will return existing data from local storage for initializing the state object after each time we reload the application. Now we have to do one more thing. From various parts of the application, we can modify this context with this function setContext, right? So whenever that happens, we have to make the same changes inside this context here also. For that, we can make use of this hook useEffect. As a first parameter, we can have this callback function, and this function will be invoked whenever there is a change inside the second parameter here. So as a second parameter inside this array, we will pass this state object context. So whenever there is a change inside this context, this callback function will be invoked. During that time, we will update the local storage. The updated value will be there inside this context. So we'll save the corresponding JSON string in local storage. So throughout the application, context API data is saved inside the local storage in real time. As per our context API configuration here, the data or the default context must be saved inside the local storage. In order to see the data saved in local storage, you can go to this tab application. So here we have the key and here we have the JSON string, and you could see the corresponding JSON object here. Now participant ID is 0. Now let's try to log in with the existing participant. That's it. Participant ID is updated to 1, and here we are inside the quiz route. Now enough with the context API or router or login form. Now let's go ahead with this quiz component, which is the meat of this application. So first of all, inside this quiz component, we have to fetch the questions that we have inside our DB. Now using this question controller here, we'll be picking random 5 questions using this getWeb method here, API/question. So first of all, we need a customized query here. So first of all, I'll be creating this variable random 5 questions, and we have to do this through async operations. So I will use the prefix avoid underscore context can be used to query the database. And here we have the collection of questions. Now we will make this selection here. Apart from selecting columns as it is, we want some customization here also. So question ID is equal to the actual question ID itself, then question in words, image name. Now here is the difference. We have 4 options and I want to return them as an array called options. Now in order to return them as an array of strings, we could do this. We'll be creating a separate array with those options. So that's it. We don't need to return the answer of this question. That will be done later. Now here comes the random selection. You can call this method order by, and we are going to order this in a random order. With that, we can make use of this class guide. We can call this method new guide. So the questions inside the table will be ordered in a random order, and from that we will take first 5 questions. Now finally we have to convert this to a list. Now let's return the same here, random 5 questions. This project is already running without debug mode here. Now in order to reflect these new changes, we just need to build this project. For that, go to build, then build solution, or you can use this shortcut Ctrl+Shift+B. So project is successfully built. Now in order to check the proper working of this web API method, you can use this Swagger interface here. So here we have the component question, and we want to make a request to this web API method. So click on try it out. Now click on execute. Boom, that's it. Here we have the server response with the code 200, meaning response went successfully. And here we can see the random 5 questions, and the options is returned as we expected in an array. Now we have to make this same request from this quiz component here, and we want to do that after completely loading this component. With that, we can make use of this default hook useEffect. Here we have the callback, and as a second parameter we have to pass an empty array. So the callback here will be executed once this component is fully loaded. And here we have to make the GET request. Now we can make use of this API function create API endpoint. As a parameter to this function we have to pass the endpoint. So I will save the corresponding here question. So this will be concatenated with the base URL and this API here. Now let's pass the same here, endpoints dot question. Now here we have to make the GET request. For that we can make use of this function fetch. Here we have the success and error callback. Now in order to store the random questions returned from the server, I'm going to create a state object questions. Let's initialize that with an empty array. Now once we receive the random questions from the server, we can update that here, response.data. Let's print the same into developer console. Reload the application again. Now let's check the console tab. That's it. Here we have the 5 random questions. Now let's look how to show these questions one at a time inside this quiz component here. So first of all, we'll make sure the questions array is populated with the server response. We'll be showing the questions if the length of the array is not equal to 0. Else we'll be returning null here. Now for displaying the question, I'll be using the Material UI component card. Inside that we have to show the card content. Here we have the typography component for showing the question in words. Variant is equal to h6, so it is similar to an h6 header. Now here we have to show this property question in words. Before that, we need another variable to represent the current question that we are dealing with. Inside this response, we have 5 questions. In order to identify which question we are currently showing inside the component, we need an index to keep track of the current question. For that, I will be creating a state object question index. Let's initialize that with 0. Now we could do this questions, and let's pass the index here. Now here we have to show the property question in words. Back to the application, reload this page. That's it. Here we have the question. Now we can list options of this question. For that, I'm going to use Material UI component list. To learn more about this component, you can go through the documentation here. So here we have the outer component list. Now for each option we have, we'll be showing this component list item button. We have 4 options. I will render them with the map function here. So here we have the corresponding question. Inside that we have an array options. Now we can call the map function. This callback has 2 parameters. First of all, the item itself and then the index. Inside the callback, we will return this list item button. First of all, I want to disable the ripple effect. So we'll set this property disable ripple. Since we are rendering this component in a loop, we have to set this key property with a unique value. I will be passing the index here. Now here we have to show the option. I will show that inside a div, HTML div, and the option is inside the parameter item. Now let's check that here. Boom, that's it. So here we have 4 options. Now along with these options, I want to show the alphabets A, B, C, and D. So I will do that with the Unicode. First of all, I will call this method string method from char code. Now here we have to pass the Unicode of capital letter A, which is 65. So this function will convert Unicode 65 into capital letter A. Now for second option, we need B as a prefix. Then C, so the Unicode letter must increment on each iteration here. For that, I will add the index. So it will work as we expect. Now let's concat a colon here. Now I want to make this prefix in bold, so I will be using this B tag here. Now let's start this card component. First of all, I will set the width to some fixed value. Now in order to center them horizontally, I will set the horizontal margin MX as auto. Now we need some top margin, so we can do this margin top of the range 5. Now let's show some heading for this card here. For that we can make use of this component card header. Here we have the property title, and this will be shown inside the header. Here I want to show question X of 5. So here we go, question. Let's concat the question number here. Let's save this back to the application. So here we have the card header. Each time we reload this page here, we will get different questions because we are randomly selecting the 5 questions. Now along with this title here, I want to show a timer. For that, first of all, I'll be creating a state object time taken. Let's initialize that with 0. Now in order to start the timer, I will be creating a separate function, start timer. Now we can call this JavaScript function setInterval. So as a first parameter, we'll be having this callback function. And then as a second parameter, here we have to pass the time in milliseconds, 1000 milliseconds here, similar to 1 second. So after each 1 second, this callback function will be invoked. And this is where we are incrementing this time taken property. It is actually representing the seconds elapsed. So we could do this set time taken. We just need to increment the time taken like this. But there is a problem with this approach here. This set function for state object is an asynchronous function and it is getting invoked after each seconds. If we try to increment this property on each seconds, the previous increment operation might not be completed before the next increment. So instead of this, it would be better to use the callback function inside the set function like this. So here we have the parameter previous value and we will increment the previous value with 1. So this callback parameter previous represent the previous value, and I think this will wait for the previous set operation to complete. So after each second, this time taken property is getting incremented second by second. Now let's start this timer as soon as we got the question from the server. So I will do that here. Now we need to do one more thing. Whenever we create or configure a set interval operation here, we need to suspend this operation when we're done with the counter. For that, I will be creating a variable called timer. The set interval function returns a reference to the created timer, and that can be assigned here. Now as I mentioned before, this use effect with this array, empty array as a second parameter is represent component did mount event, meaning this callback function is getting invoked once the component is completely loaded. Now if we return a function here like this function will get invoked whenever we leave this component, for example navigating to next component, result, or reloading the application, etc. So this is the perfect place to suspend the timer that we have created. For that, we can call this function clear interval. Inside that, we just need to pass the timer reference. So inside this property, we have the seconds taken by the participant. Now we want to show that inside this card header. I will show that with this property action within this typography component. Instead of showing the time taken in seconds, we have to format them in proper time format. For that, I'm going to create a separate folder called helper. Inside that, let's create this index.js, and here I will paste the function for converting into proper time format. So this represents the minutes and this represents the seconds. In between them we have a colon. Now let's call this function inside the component here. Now let's check how it works. So it is working as we expected. Now I want to align this timer with this title here. For that, we have to add some custom CSS. So let's inspect this element here. We can make use of this class MUI card header action. So let's copy it back to the component. Here we already have some custom CSS, so let's add the corresponding styles here and represent this outer card component, so that we have this class representing the typography here. Now in order to center that element, we can do this. First of all, we'll set the margin as 0. Now let's set this align self as center. So that's done. Here we have another problem. I think we have misspelled this property. Basically, I was just trying to disable this effect here, this ripple effect. You know what, just don't bother. Let's remove the property here. Now in order to separate this card header from this card content here, I'm going to use this Material UI component progress. We'll be showing a progress bar like this, indicating how much questions attended by the participant. With that, in between this card header and this card content, first of all, we need a box which is similar to the div in a plain HTML. Now let me copy this component from here. Now here we have to provide the value in percentage. So I will do this. First of all, we need the question number. So question index plus 1 divided by 5. Resulting value indicate how much fractions of the total question is completed. In order to convert this into percentage, we will multiply this numerator with 100. Boom, that's it. Now, when users select an option from here, we want to show the next question, right? And we want to save the selected option along with the corresponding question ID. And that's all we need for the final score calculation. So first of all, let's add a click event to the list item here. So here we have the onClick event. To this event function, we have to pass few parameters. So I will call the function inside another arrow function here, update answer. First of all, we have to pass the question ID. So let me copy this and pasting here, question ID. And then the index of the option, it's there inside this parameter IDX. Now let's define this function up above. We have two parameters, question ID and option index. First of all, let's update the selected option with the corresponding question ID. We can save that inside this array, context API array, selected options. First of all, let's destructure what we have inside the context object and corresponding set function set context. Now we can call the hook use state context. So inside this context object, we have the array selected options. Into that, we can just push an object with the question ID and the selected option index. So question ID is equal to question ID parameter. We can simplify this syntax like this. And then we have the selected index. So I will pass the option index here. Now there is a problem for doing this because this state object is immutable. We can't directly update the state object context here. It's immutable. So instead of doing this, first of all, I will copy the array here. Let's destructure the array. And this is how we copy an existing array. Now let's call this push method from this copied array. Now finally, we can update the context with this function set context. Into this function, we just need to pass an object with updated property value. So selected options array must be updated with these new values. Now along with this, we have to increment this question ID here. For that, we could do this set question index. Let's increment it to the next index. Now inside the context API, we have to update the time taken for this quiz program. And we will update this property time taken after completing 5 questions. So I'm going to have this if block here. If question index is less than 4, we will do these operations. Else, here we have the last question. So we don't have to increment the index. Along with these options, we have to update the time taken for this quiz program. So time taken is equal to, we will pass this state property here, time taken. We can even simplify that like this. So this else block will be executed for the last question. So after the 5th question, we have to navigate result component. Sorry, I misspelled this if keyword here. Before getting into the result component, we have to do a few more things inside this quiz component here. Now let's check whether it is working as expected. Let's see the local storage side by side. Now select an answer for this question. Boom. So the question is changed, and also the selected option index and the corresponding question ID is inserted to the local storage. So it's working properly fine. Now let's complete 5 questions. 5 options selected by the participant and the time taken for the quiz program is updated inside the local storage or the context API. So navigation through those questions is working perfectly fine. Here we have forgotten something. For this question, we have an image of a mouse. We want to show that just above this question and below this card header here. So let's do that before moving forward. We want to show the image in between the header and the content. And we will show the image only when there is an image name property for the question. So we can do this, image name is not equal to null. Then we will show the image here, else null. For showing the image, we can make use of this component card media. The corresponding HTML component will be img. Now with this property image, we have to pass the image URL. So inside this API file here, we have the base URL, right? And we have exported the same here. Now we can make use of that here, base URL. And inside the API, we have a folder called images. Inside that, we have this image with the name given here. Now let me save this and back to the application. Let's reload this page again and again until we find the question. Sorry, image is already showing for questions without image. So here we have to change the condition to not equal to null. Let's reload it until we find the question for the mouse. So here it is. You see, it's not working as we expected. Actually, the image is there inside the folder images with the same name that we have saved inside the DB. In order to solve this problem, first of all, we have to enable static files for this API here. For that, we can go to this program.css here. Now, just below this course configuration, from the app object, call this function use static files. Now into this method, we have to provide the directory where we have saved the static files. So we could do this static file options, file provider is equal to new physical file provider. And let's add the corresponding namespace. Now inside this, we have to pass the directory where we have saved the images. So path.combine method can be called. Now we can make use of this object builder environment dot content root path will give the path up to this project directory here. Into that, we just need to append this images, which is the name of this folder here. Now as a second parameter, we have to pass this request path. So this is the route that we want to use for accessing static files inside the folder images here. Now let's build this project. Now let's try it again. Let's try it until we find the question for mouse. Boom, here we go. Now actually here we have to apply some custom CSS to place the image properly. Before that, I want to show you the current state of the context API or local storage. See, here we have a lot of questions as a result of reloading this quiz component here. So let's fix that first. We just need to reset the context API inside this component did mount event here. Set context. Let's pass the object with updated values. So first of all, we have time taken property. Let's assign it with 0 and then the array selected options. So this will do the job. Now I want to do the similar full reset operation of the context API inside this login component here, because we can navigate back to the login component like this. In these cases also things might mess up. So let's do the full reset inside this login component also. So first of all, let's import useEffect. We can make use of this snippet, useEffect snippet. We just need an empty array, and here we can reset the context API and local storage. Now this same operation can be reused in other components. For example, if you want to log out from this application, this reset operation might be helpful. So I'm gonna define the function inside the returned object inside this hook here. Along with this set context, I'm gonna define a function reset context. And this function will be only available if we destructure the property reset context, right? Okay. First of all, let's remove the context from local storage. Now let's reset the state object context. We just need to call this function get fresh context. Now inside this login component, we can destructure this property here. And let's call the same inside this useEffect here. From both of these components, login and quiz, we will reset local storage or context API properties to keep the integrity of data saved from the application. Now back to the mouse image here. So here we have the custom CSS to properly align the image. First of all, I will set the width to auto. Now in order to align the image horizontally in center, I will set top and bottom margin 10 pixel. Horizontally, I will set the margin as auto. So it is working perfectly fine. Now before moving to the result component, we want to show a top navbar here. And inside that navbar, we'll be having a logout button to quit from this quiz application. And this navbar must be available inside this result component also. How can we do that? For that, I will create a new component, layout.js. For the top navbar, you can make use of this Material UI component app bar. So first of all, I will add the component here, app bar. I will set the position as sticky. Now inside this, we need this component toolbar. Let's import this app bar component also. For this toolbar, let's set the width same as that of the card. So width is equal to 640 pixel. And let's set the margin as auto so that it will align horizontally in center. Now let's show a heading with the app name Quiz App. Variant is H4. So here we have the title Quiz App. Now in order to show this app bar for both of these components, this should act as a parent control, right? Or a layout for these components here. That we can easily accomplish with the router. So here we have the router configuration inside the app component. Now let's wrap these two components, quiz and result, with the route layout component. Path is set as a / element is equal to layout component. So here we have the corresponding close tag. Now if you navigate into those two components, you could see the app bar. See? But the actual HTML from the component is not shown. To fix this, we can do this. Just add this tag outlet. So whatever we have inside the targeted component according to the current route will be shown in place of this outlet here. Now this component render method does not allow two outer components. So let's enclose them with React fragment like this. So here we go. You know what, when we use React Material UI components, it's better to enclose everything with this container component. So let's do that here. Now inside this app bar, let me show a logout button. Here we have the click event logout. Let's define the same function here. During logout operation, we just need to clear everything from the context API and we want to navigate into the login form, right? So first of all, I will use the hook for the state context. We just need to import this reset context method, use state context. Now for navigating back to the login form, let's create this navigate object. First of all, let's reset the context. Navigate back to the login form. So here we have the button. Before trying this out, let's align it properly. For that, we just need this custom CSS flex grow is equal to 1. So this heading will take all of the free space and thereby this logout button will push to the right side. Now let's check whether it is working or not. That's it. Now let's check the local storage. So the reset operation is working as we expected. Now let's log into the application again. Now before moving to the result page, I want to make one more change here. Inside this application here, by default in React Material UI, the default font is Roboto. Instead of that, I really like this font from this Material UI documentation here. If you inspect that, you could see it's called IBM Plex Sans. So let's grab the same from Google Fonts. So here it is. Now we'll select these font weights 300, 400, 500 and 700. Now let's copy this link from here and let's replace the same inside the index.html here. So let's replace the link like this. Now let's change the same inside this global CSS here, index.css. I will set this font as the first option. Back to the application, let's check it is working or not. No, it's not working. If you inspect here, still it is using the font Roboto. So this is by default inside the React Material UI. In order to override this rule, we just need to customize the theme like we have done inside the index.js here. So here we go, typography, and let's reset the default family with this font. Save this, back to the application, reload this. That's it. We can skip this step if you are fine with the default font. Okay, now after these 5 questions, let's navigate into the result component. Here we have the else part, and this is where we have to navigate into the result component. First of all, let's create the navigate object. So here we go, navigate /result. Let's check that here. Boom, that's it. So this is the final component inside the application. Hope you are happy with the progress that we have made. Inside this component, we have to show the score of this quiz program along with the correct answers. So first of all, we'll be making a post request to the web API with the question IDs, and from the web API, we have to return the questions along with the correct answers. For that, inside this question controller here, I will customize this post web API method here. So into this web API method, we'll be passing an array of integers. So I will name this parameter as question IDs. Let's rename this method as retrieve answers. And also I want to change the route for this web method here. So let's use this attribute route get answers. So in order to make a request to this web API method here, the corresponding URI will be like this: API/question, then get answers. Now let me get rid of everything inside the web API here. We'll be retrieving answers into this variable answers here, and we'll be returning the same at the end. Now how can we retrieve the questions for the given IDs here? So first of all, here we have the avoid keyword. Now we could do this context.questions contain the collection of questions inside the DB. Now let's filter the records based on their question ID X such that we will select the question if the ID of this question is present inside the array. For that, we can make use of this array method contain, and let's pass the question ID here. So that will return the questions that we are looking for. Now let's select the column properties as we have done before. So let me copy this from the getVerb method. We already used this X here for this lambda expression here. Just to avoid the confusion, I will rename this parameter as Y. Now along with these properties, we need the answer also. So answer is equal to Y.answer. Okay, finally, let's convert this to a list. So we can call this function to list async. So here we have selected the questions with the IDs inside this array here, and here we have selected the properties as we have done before, including the answer. Now let's build this project. Let's make the post request directly from this result component here. We have to make the post request once the component is completely loaded. So let's use this user effect hook. Before making the request, first of all, we have to create the array of question IDs for passing to this parameter here. So here we go. Let's import the context. Context.selected options contains the question ID and selected options. We only need the question ID, so we can call this array method map. Now here we will just return the question ID. Inside this quiz component, we have saved the question ID here, and the same is retrieved with this map method here. Now let's make the API request. So here we have the API function create API endpoint. Let's call that here. We already have an endpoint for question, but this time it's different. I will create new property get answers. So question/get answers. Now let's pass the same here endpoints dot get answers. Let's call this method post. The data that we want to post can be passed to this function here. So here is the collection of IDs. Now here we have the callback function for both success and error. Inside the success response for now, let's print the data retrieved from the server. So response.data contains the data that we have returned from the API. Reload and let's check the dev console. Surprisingly, we got 8 answers instead of 5. So there is some bug. Let me check that and I will be back in a minute. Finally, I found the reason. We had a typo inside this quiz component here. Instead of this, we have to provide selected options. Save this. Reload this. Now let's select answers randomly. Now let's check the dev console to see the return response from the server API. Boom. So here we have the 5 questions that we have just attended and their proper answers. Now we have to merge this array with the array that we have saved inside our local storage or the context API here. Inside that we have the selected options index that we have chosen during the quiz program. Once we merge these two arrays, we can calculate the score out of 5. So first of all, we'll create a state property score. And here we have the array to store the merged result. Now let's do the merging inside this callback here. Actually, here we are going to merge the answers and questions received from the response into the selected options array inside the context here. And thereby we can preserve the order of questions that we have just attended. So here we go. Context dot selected options contains those attended questions with the selected option index. Now from this array we want to call this map method. Let me split this into multiple lines. Each of the item inside the array is represented with X. Now from this map method we are returning an object by combining the properties from both of the arrays. First of all, let's destructure the properties from this array. Now here we have to find the question from the response for the current question ID. So inside this response data, we have the collection or array of questions. From that, we can call this method find. And here we have the condition y.questionID is equal to x.questionID. So this will return the question for the current question ID here. Now we want to merge the properties from this record. Let's simplify the syntax here. We don't need this return keyword. Let's wrap this object with a pair of parentheses like this. So inside this array, we have merged both the answer and the selected options. Now we can easily find this code. So first of all, I will update this array to this question answer object here. Now I will define a separate function to calculate this score. This function accepts the array of question answers, and let's calculate the score inside this function. Now let me call the function here. For calculating this score, I will be using the array method reduce. We have already discussed this JavaScript array method in great depth in one of my JavaScript tutorial. I have given the link in video description and inside the icon top right corner. You can watch that if you find reduce method a little difficult to understand. So here we have the callback function with accumulator and current value. In order to initialize this accumulator, I will pass 0 here. Now here we can do this. We will compare the correct answer with the selected option. So if they match each other, we will return the incremented accumulator, else the existing accumulator will be returned. So in brief, this reduce method will iterate through each of the records inside this array here, and these two properties answer and selected will be compared. If they match each other, this accumulator get incremented. Initially the accumulator will be having 0, and based on the condition here from each iteration the accumulator get incremented, and finally this reduce returns number of questions where we have answered correctly. So I will save that into this temp variable here. Now let's update this score property. Now I'll be showing this score inside the component using Material UI card component. So here we have the card documentation, and for showing this score I have copied this card UI controls here. I don't want to extend this tutorial furthermore, so here's my customized card. Content will be shown on the first half, and then we will be having an image, and this image is already saved or copied into this public folder here. So this is the image that I have copied, and I'll be showing along with the card result here. Okay, so this is how it looks like. Now we want to show this score here. Now first of all, we will show this text or heading congratulations, and then here we have the title saying your score, and here we have shown the score within this typography. Score will be inside the state object score, so that's what I have shown inside this typography. So this will be similar to a span component in HTML. So we got this score out of 5. Now finally we have to show the time taken for this quiz program. For that I will be adding a new typography component here like this. Here we have called the helper method get format. Into that we have passed the time taken from the context API. So here it is. Something went wrong. Let's check that. Sorry, here we have made a major mistake. Instead of this curly brackets, we have to use square brackets. So here it is. Now just beneath this code, we need 2 buttons for submitting this code to the API and 1 button to restart this quiz program. So I will add those 2 buttons just below this time taken heading. So here we have the button for submitting this code that we have received, and here we have the button to restart the program. Now let's implement the click event for this retry button with this function restart. First of all, we want to reset the context API data like we have done inside this quiz component did mount here. So let me copy this and pasting here. Now we want to navigate into this quiz component here. So first of all, we need a navigator object. So let me copy this and pasting here. Let's import this hook. Now we could do this navigate /quiz. Let's try the button here. Boom, that's it. Let's implement the click event for this submit button here. So during the submission, we have to update the current participant score and the time taken for this quiz program. So let's create an update web method inside this participant controller here. So here we have the put web API method. Now into this web API method, we will be passing only these properties: question ID, score, and time taken. Rest of the properties like email, name is not saved inside the context API, so it's not possible to pass them, and it's not necessary to pass them here. So I'll be creating a separate class to receive the data from the client side. So here's the class participant result with these properties: participant ID, score, and time taken. Now this model will be used for receiving the data inside this method here. So participant result, I'll rename this parameter as _participant result. Now we will compare the ID that we have passed with the ID inside this object _participant result. So the value inside this ID parameter, it will be passed along with the URI, and the ID inside this model property must be matched. If not, a bad request will be returned. Now we have to find the participant record with the given ID here. So first of all, we can call this find function from the participant DB set property. So this will find the participant record with the given ID here. Now we have to update the participant score and the time taken for the quiz program like this. And here we have set this participant state as modified. And with this save changes method here, it will update the new values provided here. Rest of the value will be as it is since we have retrieved with the find method here. Only these two properties are getting updated. Now here we have the catch block to handle concurrency exception, and finally everything when successful, we won't return anything. Now in order to reflect these new changes, let's build this project again. After successful build, back to the React application here. Let's add a click event to this submit button here. Now let's define this function. In order to make the pull request, we can make use of the API function here. Let's import. Into the function, we have to pass the corresponding endpoint which is already there. In order to make the pull request to the web API method, we have to make the request to this URL API /participant then the ID. So we could do this endpoints dot participant. Now to make the put request, there is a function called put inside this function here. To this function, we have to pass the ID and the object with the updated values. So here we have the participant ID. Now we have to pass the object with updated values along with the participant ID, then score, then time taken for this quiz program. Now here we have the callback for success and error response. Now inside this success callback here, I just want to print the response to check whether this update operation went successful or not. Reload this, submit the score. Boom, that's it. We got the response with the status 204 no content, meaning update operation went successful. Now after this successful operation, I just want to show a notification saying operation went successful. For that, we can make use of this Material UI component alert. So here we have the alert component. Inside that, we will show this submitted successfully. And for customizing this component, I will add this SX property like this. Now if you check the component, you could always see this alert component here. We only want to show this after this successful submit operation here. For that, I'm going to create a new state property, show alert. And let's initialize that with the boolean value false. Now after this successful submit operation, I will set the corresponding property here. We only want to show the alert for a few seconds. So we can do this. We can call this function set timeout. This callback will be called after 3 or 4 seconds. So we can pass the seconds in milliseconds here. Inside this, we will reset this property here. Now based on this state property, we need to set the visibility of this alert component here. So we'll update this visibility property based on the value like this. Okay, so if this property is true, we will set the visibility as visible, otherwise hidden. Initially the alert component is hidden. Now let's try to submit this code again. Boom, that's it. Now finally we need to show the questions with their correct answers. Before that, I want to highlight this score here. For that, inside this result component, I will be importing this color green from Material UI colors. Now let's pass the same inside this score typography here. We could do this color is equal to green with this shade 500. That's it. Now let's show the questions with their correct answers. For that, I'm going to create a new component, answer. Now we'll show this answer component inside this result component here, answer. Into this component, we need to pass the merged question answer array. For that, I will be using this property question answers. We can pass the state object question answers here. Now let's wrap everything inside this component with the React fragment. Now let's destructure the array that we have passed inside this answer component here. So here it is. Now for displaying question answers, I'll be using the Material UI component accordion. It's a really useful component and it's perfectly appropriate inside this quiz application for showing the correct answers. The integration of this component is pretty simple. You can go through this documentation here. So first of all, I will wrap everything with this box component with some custom CSS. Now we will map through this question answer array like this. Okay, for each question we'll be showing an accordion component here. For this accordion component, there is two parts. First of all, the header part, which is the summary, and the content. Inside this documentation, this is the header part or summary, and here we have the accordion details. So inside this summary, we'll be showing the question in words property inside this typography title here. Now inside this accordion details, we'll be showing the image if there is an image for this question. We have already discussed these components already in previous quiz components, so I'm not going to explain them. You already know it. Now here we have to show the options of this question like we have done in the previous quiz component like this. Exactly like we have done in previous component. Now let's save this and back to the application here. Boom, that's it. So here we have the accordion. Now inside this accordion, I only want to open one accordion at a time. To do so, we need a state object here called expanded. Now inside this property, we'll be saving the currently open accordion index. So first of all, we have to handle this onChange event. So here we have the function handle change. Into that, we'll pass this accordion index. So here's the function handle change. For this function, we have the single parameter panel, which is actually the index of the accordion. Now inside this function, this nested function will be invoked. It has two default parameters for this onChange event. First of all, the event itself, and here we have the property indicating whether this accordion component is already opened or not. Now inside this function, we just need to set this expanded property here. So if it is already expanded, that means if we click on an accordion, it will get open and this handle event change will be invoked. So this is expanded property will be true. In that case, the current accordion index will be saved to this state property here, otherwise false. Now based on this property, we can conditionally apply whether this accordion is opened or not. For that, we can do this. Here we have the expanded property of the component accordion. If the ID inside this expanded state property is equal to the current index j, this property will set as true and thereby this accordion will be opened. Now if we go back to the component here, now this time we can only open one accordion at a time. See? Now we need an expanded icon like this here. You can search for icons inside the Material UI like this. Icons page or documentation is here. Now if you go to this link here, you can see all of the Material UI icons. You can select the icon, then copy this import statement here. For this accordion here, I have imported this icon here. Expanded circle down icon. Now we can pass this icon to this component accordion summary like this. Sorry, I forgot to mention this. Before using Material UI icons, we have to install this package here. Let's open a terminal, Let's execute the command here. Installation of the package will take some time, so please be patient. After all, let's reload the application. Now I want to show these icons in green and red color based on whether the participant answered the question correctly or not. For that, I will be adding this SX property here. And here we can set the color property. If the selected option index is similar to the answer, we will show this green color, otherwise we will show the red color. Now make sure to import these two colors, green and red, here. Boom, that's it. I want to show this icon detail here in gray color. For that, along with these two colors, green and red, let's import gray and let's set the color for this details component here. Now inside these options, I want to mark the correct answer in green color and the wrong option in red color. That can be done for this typography component here. We will call this function mark correct or not. Into this function we'll be passing the question object and this option index, and this function will be returning an object, and that returned object will be destructured here. Now let's define this function mark correct or not. So here we have the function with those two passed parameters, question answer object and the option index. Now here we have the if clause. First of all, I'll be creating an array with those two indices. So here we have the correct option answer index, and here we have the selected option index. We only want to mark the current option as correct or not if the index is either the selected index here or the correct answer index. So we can call the array method includes with the current option index. Now inside this if clause, we'll be returning an object with the SX property. That's what we use to customize Material UI components, and we will set this property with this object containing this property color. Inside that, we will conditionally apply the colors. If the current option is the correct answer, then we will return the green color, otherwise we will return the red color. Now let me save this and back to the application. Boom, that's it. Which of the following is not operating system? Correct answer is CSS, and the selected option is Unix, which is wrong answer. And here we have the question that participant answered correctly. Now finally, there is one more small topic to be discussed. Let's log out from this application. I want to make these two routes, which are quiz route and result route, as protected, meaning without logging into this application, if user or the participant directly enter the quiz component URL here, we have to prevent the user from accessing this quiz component without the actual login operation. This time the actual participant ID will be 0, so everything will mess up at the end of the result. So let's look how to make these two routes as protected. It's very simple. We just need to create a component like this, authenticate. Now we just need to wrap these two routes, result and quiz, with the newly created component authenticate. So here is the route, and we need to set the element as the new component authenticate. Now here we have the corresponding clause tag. Now back to the component authenticate. Now in order to check whether a user is authenticated or not, we can make use of the context API property participant ID. So first of all, I will destructure the context here. Now we just need to do this context dot participant ID can be compared with 0. If it is equal to 0, we could say the participant is not logged in. In that case, we have to redirect the user to the login component. For that, we can make use of this navigate component from router. Now with this to property, we can specify the targeted route where we want to redirect the unauthenticated participants. So it will be the default route, which is login form. And here we have the else part, meaning there is a participant ID inside the context. In that case, everything should happen as per the route. For that, we can just return this outlet component like this. Sorry, here we have a typo. Let's save this, back to the application. Currently we are not authenticated or logged in. Now let's try to access this quiz route here. That's it. The context participant ID is 0, and thereby we redirected to the login component. Now let's try after login operation. It's working perfectly fine. That's it guys. Hope you found this tutorial helpful. You can download or clone this project from the GitHub repository link given in video description. For more React and .NET Core API tutorials like this, please consider subscribing to this channel CodAffection if you haven't yet. Please like and share this video with your friends and colleagues so that they can also benefit from this. See you in next video.